Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program, Charlottesville and the Case Against White Supremacy, part of the Jewish Museum Milwaukee's Critical Conversation Starter Series. My name is Patty Sherman-Sisler, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. As part of our commitment to use art and history to examine contemporary issues, and in conjunction with our current exhibit, Luba Lukova, Designing Justice, we are really honored to share the critical work of filmmaker Alex Horowitz, Integrity First of America, the counsel from the law firm Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, and Reggie Jackson from Nurturing Diversity Partners here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and of course to our esteemed moderator, Hannah Rosenthal. We also welcome our colleagues and co-sponsors from the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles and the National Museum of American Jewish History, as well as the Jewish Community Relations Council here in Milwaukee and part of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. I can't understate how important this program is in these times of hate, times of increased anti-Semitism, of racial and religious bigotry and intolerance. We will examine the landscape of tactics of one group, the fight to silence them, the impact of this hate nationally and in Milwaukee. Taking on and taking down these violent extremists is all the more critical given recent events. Thank you to all of our partners. A special thank you to Leslie Hayes, who sponsored tonight's event for the Milwaukee Jewish Museum, and to the Milwaukee Jewish Museum members who make these programs possible. The program will begin with a short screening of the short film Reawakening by Alexander Horowitz, in which rabbis and members of the Charlottesville Only Synagogue voice responses to the 2017 Unite the Right rallies and discuss how anti-Semitism that they experienced and how it transformed their community. Alex Horowitz, a former senior producer at CNN International, spent nearly 10 years covering business and economics for CNN and its various networks from bureaus in New York, Washington, London, and Hong Kong. She now works independently as a writer, director, and producer of documentary shorts for nonprofits, often on subjects related to Judaism. She has produced films for the Jewish Museum of Maryland, the Capitol Jewish Museum in DC, and more. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post. Her film, Reawakening, which you'll see this evening, has been invited to screen at the San Diego International Jewish Film Festival, at the Twin Cities Jewish Film Festival, and it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Alex Horowitz.
Thank you so much, Patty. On August 12th, 2017, I was working out in a hotel gym in Western Massachusetts. As I rode the elliptical, I watched TV and saw hundreds of marchers in Charlottesville carrying torches and chanting, "Jews will not replace us." I was stunned. Never in my half-century of life as an American Jew had I encountered the kind of hatred now on screen. The brazen demonstration bore no resemblance to my day-to-day experience. Jews of Charlottesville also felt this disconnect, I learned later. White supremacy was not something that normally permeated their daily lives. That this violence came literally to the doorstep of their synagogue truly surprised them. But as they reached out into the broader Charlottesville community to build bonds and push back against the hatred, they realized that their African-American neighbors were not shocked at all by the violence. That was a significant realization, and it changed them. What I've tried to capture in this film is not only how the Jews struggled to confront white supremacy, but also how that struggle transformed their understanding, both of themselves and their city. Reawakening is based on the Charlottesville Jewish Oral History Project, a project conducted by Dr. Phyllis Leffler, Professor Emerita of History at the University of Virginia. It was made possible by a grant from the Southern Jewish Historical Society.
Good evening. I'm Molly Dubin, and I'm the curator with the Jewish Museum, Milwaukee. Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing that poignant and catalyzing film with us. 3 years ago, neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on Charlottesville, Virginia for a weekend of violence. This violence was no accident. Rather, it was the result of months of planning, and it served as a harbinger of the cycle of extremist terror that has followed. Integrity First for America, or IFA, in partnership with a world-class legal team, is taking on the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, the hate groups at the center of this violent movement, holding them accountable in federal court for the violence they brought to Charlottesville in 2017. This evening, we will hear about this landmark case, brought forth with the goals of disrupting extremism, interrupting cycles with historical roots, contemporary manifestations, and future ramifications, both nationally and locally, and dismantling and bankrupting these hate groups and their leaders. I am pleased and honored to introduce the esteemed panelists and moderator who will be leading us through tonight's critical conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Amy Spitalnik. She is the Executive Director of Integrity First for America. Amy and IFA are backing Sines and Kessler, the landmark federal lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the August 2017 violence. Amy joins IFA with extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General, communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and communications director in the New York State Senate. She has also worked on a number of federal, state, and local campaigns and advocacy organizations. We also have with us Michael Block. He is counsel at Kaplan, Heckler & Fink, LLP. Michael is an experienced trial attorney who spent over 7 years as a public defender at the Bronx Defenders and 3 years as a litigation associate at Williams & Connolly, LLP, before joining Kaplan Heckler. Mike is currently partnering with Integrity First for America on the Charlottesville litigation. We have with us Reggie Jackson. Reggie is the co-founder and lead trainer at Nurturing Diversity Partners. He is a nationally heralded independent scholar and much sought after speaker, researcher, writer, and consultant with deep comprehensive knowledge of how our country's racial hierarchy developed historically and its impact on our lives today. For over 15 years, he served as the head griot, which is the oral historian, for America's Black Holocaust Museum. And a few years ago, he and his longtime colleague at the America's Black Holocaust Museum, Dr. Fran Kaplan, founded Nurturing Diversity Partners, which uses methods they've honed over many years to build bridges from our past to our future across racial, ethnic, urban, suburban, rural, generational, and other divides. And we have with us our esteemed moderator for the evening, Hannah Rosenthal. Hannah is the former president and CEO of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation and has spent her career successfully advocating for Jewish causes. Prior to joining the Federation, Hannah served as special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the US State Department. She also served as executive director of the Chicago Foundation for Women, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, and the Wisconsin Women's Council. Having introduced our panelists, I turn it over to our moderator, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Molly. It is a very esteemed panel, and I don't know how we're going to get all the information out in such a short period of time. I do want to say that as the child of a Holocaust survivor, I have spent my life making sure we don't use the word Nazi unless they're Nazis, and that we be very careful about invoking the Holocaust. And then in August of 2017, I, like everyone else, watched as Charlottesville crossed that line. And there was no other way of defining it, with the swastikas, with the calls, with using Nazi language, that I had to realize that's what we're dealing with here. And this discussion we're going to have and the trial is going to be a fabulous opportunity to hold people accountable, particularly lately with the racial tensions going on in our country and nobody being held accountable for murder, for discrimination, and you know. And so the timing is good. The timing is really good. And I want to take us back to 2017. And Michael, I'd like to start with you. Take us back there, and what happened in Charlottesville that made the law firm feel we have a suit here?
Sure. Thank you, Hannah. And then thank you all for having us and for shining a light on this case and this issue. I agree the timing couldn't be more important to have this discussion. So in terms of what happened in 2017, I think the most prominent event that everybody knows about is the car attack where James Fields drove Dodge Challenger through a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring scores of others. But I think what our suit uncovered and will hopefully show in vivid detail at trial is that it really was an entire weekend of terror. The weekend started Friday night, August 11th, when the white supremacists and Nazis, and I agree Nazis is an appropriate term for this group, marched, as you saw in that powerful video, marched through University of Virginia campus carrying tiki torches, chanting "Jews will not replace us," chanting "blood and soil," other Nazi slogans. They marched through the lawn over the rotunda, which is the iconic building in UVA's campus. And they marched down to the Thomas Jefferson statue, where there were about 20 counter-protesters, mostly UVA students that were surrounding the statue, just peacefully counter-protesting. They were holding up signs that said UVA students against white supremacy, for example. And there were about 500 white supremacists and neo-Nazis that surrounded them with tiki torches, and ultimately attacked them, throwing torches at them, throwing lighter fluid, kicking, punching, assaulting, all manner of kind of assault. And they injured a number of people in that particular incident, some of whom have become our clients in this litigation. The following day, actually, I should note, actually, at the end of that day, I think tellingly, the white supremacists celebrated what they thought was a great victory, in large part because, as we ultimately discovered, that all of this was planned. Saturday, the following day, the same group of white supremacists marched through downtown Charlottesville, committing all sorts of other violence in addition to the car attacks, similarly kind of charging through groups of counter-protesters, injuring other folks. And then finally, as we talked about, James Fields, at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon or so, drove his car through the crowd of counter-protesters. So that, in a nutshell, is what took place on the ground in Charlottesville in August of 2017. And in terms of what gave us confidence that there was a suit is that it turns out, as was revealed shortly after the rally, all of this was planned. It was planned on a social media platform called Discord, which has invite-only servers where Discord is generally geared towards video game players. But the organizers of this rally and the defendants in our lawsuit created their own server called the Charlottesville 2.0 server. And they planned the rally in meticulous detail on the server from about June through the rally in August. And as you can see in the chats that they were initially leaked online, and as you can see in our complaint, and hopefully we'll see in much more vivid detail at trial, they discussed just every detail of the rally. They talked about the uniforms that they were going to wear. They talked about the formations they would march in. They talked about fighting tactics. They talked about whether it was legal to run over counter-protesters in Virginia. They researched carefully self-defense laws in Virginia explicitly so that they could sort of understand better how to kind of effectively, if possible, get away with what they were planning. They had medics on hand for the aftermath. It was all meticulously planned. And I can talk about kind of the legal theory that fits in. But generally speaking, what became clear quickly was that what played out in Charlottesville was very much by design and illegal. Happy to talk about the legal theory now, or
Yeah, that would be great. That was my next question.
Sure. So we sued under a federal statute called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which was a statute passed by the Reconstructionist Congress to really give teeth to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, amendments that abolished slavery, gave equal protection, as well as the right for African Americans to vote. And the idea of the statute is that it gives a private cause of action and ability to sue in federal court to victims of conspiracy to commit racially motivated violence, essentially is the legal theory in our case. And so basically what that means is, to the extent there is an agreement, which is really all a conspiracy is, of two or more, and in this case there were certainly more, people to commit violence against people for the purpose of with racial and religious animus in mind, and that is exactly what what the evidence shows in this case, is that what these defendants did is that over the course of the two months or so leading up to the rally, they planned to commit violence against racial minorities and people who support racial minorities, which the statute also protects. And so that's the theory, the primary theory under which we sued.
How did you end up with the plaintiffs?
So the suit was filed by Roberta Kaplan, who is the founder of our law firm, Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink. And Robbie, people may know, before this case, brought down the Defense of Marriage Act in United States versus Windsor, which she argued and won in the Supreme Court. And she, at the time, was at a law firm in New York, and she left that firm to start this firm with a heavy emphasis on public interest litigation. And literally days after she started this firm, Charlottesville happened. She and the very few members of the firm at the time were watching, they were actually watching the president's remarks, and just decided almost immediately that something needed to be done. Robbie ultimately contacted a close friend of hers who lives in Charlottesville, the writer Dahlia Lithwick, that many of you may know, who was living in Charlottesville at the time, actually left Charlottesville because of this event shortly thereafter. And Robbie went down, just, I think 48 hours later, was on a plane and flew to Charlottesville and met our clients, who each of whom were injured in some respect in the rally, either Friday night or many of them in the car attack on Saturday. And she spoke to and found a very diverse, passionate, brave group of people that had been in Charlottesville that weekend to stand up against hate, that notwithstanding the trauma that they had experienced that weekend, were ready, willing, and able to continue to stand up against hate through this lawsuit. And each of them readily agreed to participate.
How many of them are there?
So there are 9. And as I mentioned, they're a very diverse background, both kind of racially, ethnically, religiously, professionally. There is a member of the clergy, law student or former law student, she's now graduated, UVA undergraduate students, and a doctor. We've sort of a whole, a fair cross-section of the community that experienced everything that happened that weekend.
I failed to tell everyone who's listening that you can be writing in questions in the chat technology on the bottom of Zoom. And we are getting some. And so as questions arise, send them in, and I hopefully will have time to be able to put them in. Quickly, Amy, how did IFA get involved, and what is your role in this trial and this whole ordeal?
So Integrity First for America is a civil rights nonprofit that was conceived of in 2017, understanding that, to perhaps put it lightly, there might be a vacuum when it comes to civil rights protections in the United States. And unfortunately, that has been borne out. We've seen in recent years how, for example, Department of Justice civil rights investigations and prosecutions are down nearly 2/3 from the end of the Obama administration. You can go on and on about the ways in which civil rights work and and counter-extremism work has been disinvested from in recent years. And IFA was conceived of in 2017, not long after Charlottesville happened. And as IFA was considering where there would be in a particular need and whether perhaps this Department of Justice would be as enthusiastic about pursuing robust civil rights litigation to hold accountable those responsible, it became clear that there was a need. And as Robbie Kaplan and her team conceived of this case, it seemed like a perfect fit for IFA to come in. And so very quickly, we partnered with Robbie and the broader legal team. Our role is to support this case in every way, shape, and form. It means we are financially supporting the plaintiffs. In a case like this, the biggest expenses are not what you would expect. They are actually security for our plaintiffs, our legal team, our own team. Evidence collection, because as I'm sure we'll talk about, these defendants are prone to losing their cell phones or perhaps dropping them in the toilet, as a few of them have claimed. And it's not cheap to scrape the evidence off of those devices. But I think also our role, particularly as you and so many have alluded to, is to make sure we understand how Charlottesville fits into the broader cycle of extremist violence that we're seeing. And it's so important to understand that Charlottesville was not an isolated incident, but rather a flashpoint and a harbinger in the rise of white supremacist terror in recent years. And we see these deep, disturbing connections from the Charlottesville defendants through the subsequent cycle of violence. I can rattle a few off now, but I know we'll be talking about them throughout the evening because it's impossible to talk about what's happening in this country without talking about our defendants, because they are so central to this violence. We know, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of that attack later this month, communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. The Christchurch shooter, who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque last year in New Zealand, painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was first popularized by one of our defendants. And Christchurch in turn inspired the Poway attack and the El Paso attack last year. And even now, during both the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests, we see over and over again how central these defendants are to this broader movement. We know, for example, a member of National Socialist Movement, one of the neo-Nazi groups we're suing, tried to bomb a hospital in Missouri in March at the beginning of the pandemic, specifically targeting institutions providing services to those with the virus. We know that there has been a horrifying rise in car attacks in recent months, many of them influenced and inspired by the same sorts of memes Mike described earlier that we saw in the Charlottesville chats. And we see our defendants also cropping up over and over again, spreading disinformation, violence, and terror online, including one of the white supremacist groups that posed as Antifa in a fake tweet and urged violence in neighborhoods as a means to really rile up armed extremists. And so when IFA considered how could we make a major impact, not just in protecting people's civil rights and holding accountable those responsible, this case was perfect because it allows us to take on, and through the large civil judgments we'll win at trial and the financial and legal impacts we've already had on the defendants, effectively bankrupt and dismantle them in ways that no other legal effort in this country can do right now.
Who are the defendants and what are we trying to get from them? And can I just add one other question quickly, and that is, do we anticipate that the defendant's defense will be First Amendment rights?
Do you want me to start, Mike, and then you can jump in?
Sure.
The defendants are people you will know. Richard Spencer, for example, perhaps the most famous neo-Nazi in America. By the way, he has called our case financially crippling, which is worth noting. When you talk
Congratulations.
That was when I think about the awful things happening in this world, sometimes I think back to that hearing, and that gives me a little motivation and hope. Richard Spencer, Chris Cantwell, who was just convicted of extortion and threats in another case. He's known as the crying Nazi if you saw the Vice documentary. Andrew Anglin, who just last week posted on his website, The Daily Stormer, which is the most trafficked hate site in the world, that the president's comments during the debate were a call for a race war during the election. And then groups like National Socialist Movement, one of the leading neo-Nazi groups, Vanguard America, League of the South, which is a neo-Confederate hate group, on and on, certain KKK groups, on and on the list goes. There's about 24 of them all together, and we'll put the full list in the chat so people can explore who they are. But as I mentioned earlier, these really are the groups and the leaders who are at the center of this movement, so that by taking them on through this case, we believe we can have impacts that extend well beyond Charlottesville in disrupting them. And then, Mike, you want to talk about the First Amendment piece?
Sure. The answer is yes. They are raising defenses under the First Amendment. It's one of their primary defenses. The claim is straightforward that basically what they did in Charlottesville is protected by the First Amendment. And I think what's critical to point out is that we, on the plaintiff side, have been very careful to make sure that we are asserting claims based exclusively on conduct primarily, but to the extent it's based on speech at all, it's speech that's not protected. So our focus is violence and the plans to commit violence. If all the defendants had done is gone to Charlottesville and waved flags with swastikas on them and said hateful and anti-Semitic and racist things, we would have to agree that the First Amendment protects their right to do that. But that's not even close to what they did. They committed violence, and we often say that the First Amendment protects their right to use whatever flag they want. But it doesn't protect their right to beat people with it, which is what they did. And similarly, to the extent there's any speech whatsoever implicated in our suit, it's speech that goes to planning violence, which also is not protected for obvious reasons by the First Amendment. So they have raised a First Amendment defense. They first forwarded in a motion to dismiss, which was denied by the judge, and they will once again raise a defense at trial. And I think the suit that we brought does a pretty good job at avoiding anything that's even remotely close to protected speech.
And one quick note on that: in addition to the judge rejecting those arguments in his opinion on the motions to dismiss, which is actually in chat if anyone wants to read that, I highly recommend it, even if you're not a lawyer. A number of former ACLU presidents and leaders have also come out in support of our case, because this case uniquely takes on these hate groups and leaders in a way that allows us to go after them for their actions as opposed to just their speech. And they believe that this case is about those actions and doesn't violate free speech in ways that perhaps some other litigation might. And that's an important point to note, given how often the defendants will try to raise this claim throughout the course of the trial.
We will get back to the case, but we have to be asking ourselves, Reggie, how did we get here? This didn't just happen because this closed technology allowed them to talk to each other. And I just have to add to the resume that Molly used in introducing you, that when I headed the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, we awarded you our Social Justice Award. You are a hero, and I know I'm going to hang on every word you say, but how is it that we're here? How is it that this is being raised? This case was raised 3 times last night at the Vice Presidential debate. You heard in the movie a number of Jews saying, we just didn't know there was this much hate. Mm-hmm. You unfortunately know. So tell us, how did we get here?
Well, you know, I always often say to people that this type of hatred is as American as apple pie. These mindsets go back many, many years. You know, the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan was formed as America's first organized terrorist group right after the Civil War ended, and blacks were given, you know, certain rights that they had never had before, and they wanted to ensure that they would not, you know, be able to take advantage of those rights, you know, whether it be citizenship rights, the right to vote, you know, equal protection under the law. They wanted to make sure that blacks would not enjoy those privileges. And so what they started to do is to become very, very violent. The reason that the 1871 Anti-Klan Act was passed was because of how violent they were. They were exceptionally violent, beating, killing blacks, raping black women and girls, looting communities that blacks lived in. They did some exceptionally horrific things, and eventually they went out of business as a result of that law. But they were reinvented in 1915. They came back, and that iteration of the Klan, the second iteration, was the largest Klan of all time. You know, they were founded in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and in the 1920s, they were one of the most popular groups in the country. There were millions of members of the Ku Klux Klan. There's these group of famous images from 1926 where the Klan had this huge rally and march in Washington, D.C. down Pennsylvania Avenue. And you can see, you know, the different Klan groups from multiple states with their, you know, their flags. American flags, not Confederate flags, American flags, and 30,000 Klan members were there. 100,000 supporters were there lining the streets of Pennsylvania Avenue to cheer them on. And I always tell people that when it comes to these hate groups, the real danger is not the groups itself. The real danger is in the people who support them in a variety of different ways. And so when we think about, you know, this particular lawsuit, I'm often, and I asked Michael when we met last week about a case that happened in the early 1980s that was very similar to this lawsuit. There was a police officer killed in Mobile, Alabama. A black man was arrested and he was tried 3 different times. You know, it was a hung jury each time because he didn't do it. And so what ends up happening, the largest Klan group in the country at that time, the United Klans of America, had a rally. And the leader of that group got on the podium and he was very upset that this black man had gotten off for, you know, purportedly killing this white police officer. And he said these infamous words: if a black man can get away with killing a white man, then a white man should be able to get away with killing a black man. And that led his son and 2 other members of the United Klans of America to go searching for a black man to murder. And unfortunately for a young 19-year-old black man by the name of Michael Donald, who was walking down the street, just bought a pack of cigarettes and was on his way back home, they pulled up next to him in a car. They accosted him, threw him in the back of the trunk of the vehicle, took him out to an area outside of town and beat him, you know, unmercifully. He fought back the best he could against these 3 men, but eventually they hit him in the head with a brick branch from a tree, and then they cut his neck to make sure he was dead. They put a rope around his neck, the lynching rope around his neck, strangled him. They wanted to make sure he was dead. And so it ends up happening because of who they are. They bragged about it, and eventually they were arrested, and you know, they were tried and convicted. And one of them has been executed by the state of Alabama. Another never went to trial because he died before the trial, a man who said those words. But another member is serving life in prison because he turned state's evidence and told what happened. But what came out of that was a lawsuit. Michael Donald's mother was contacted by the Southern Poverty Law Center, Morris Dees group. There contacted her and said, you need to sue the United Klans of America for what they did to your son. And she filed this suit, very similar to this suit, and she bankrupted the United Klans of America, the largest and most continuously active Klan group in the country. And so it set a model for future, you know, attempts. But what I think is really important for us to understand currently right now is that these individuals planned these things over a long period of time, but these are not things that just came out of the blue, that they just decided, you know, in 2017 that we're going to do these types of things. They have been planning a race war. They have been planning to disrupt the democracy that we, you know, all enjoy in this country. They have been planning to create a nation that is an exclusive nation that's only for the people that they want it to be for. They are a group that hates a variety of different people. You know, when we think about where we are, looking back 100 years ago is very instructive to where we are now. You know, we talk about all of the conversations about immigration. We talk about this violence, all of these things. These exact same things were happening 100 years ago, but we didn't learn about it in history class. You know, we leave out all the ugly stuff in our history textbooks. And so we don't know that back in the 1920s, when the Klan was in its heyday, that we also passed the strictest immigration laws in American history that put quotas on who could come into the country. And some of the groups that they were trying to keep out were Southern and Eastern Europeans, and in particular, people who were Russian Jews escaping the pogroms, you know, running for their lives, trying to get into this country. And they put quotas in place in 1924 that were in place until the 1960s. And so, you know, the Jewish community has had just an exceptionally long history of fighting against these types of elements, and they seem to follow the Jewish community wherever they go. There's never been a time in this country where the Jewish community has not had to deal with these types of folks. And as those folks in Charlottesville learned that, listen, you are not an exclusive group just because you think that you are protected. The Black folks in Charlottesville said, listen, these people that are marching and protesting and doing what they're doing, we've been talking about them for a long time and no one has listened. So it took those tragic events in Charlottesville for the Jewish community there to wake up and understand that, wow, we're under siege once again. And it's unfortunate that the events that came out today with you know, this group that was attempting to literally kidnap the governor of Michigan, another, you know, one of these militia white supremacist groups, you know, the incident that happened in Kenosha with the young man who murdered 2 individuals and shot another. These are all part and parcel of the current state of affairs in America. And it's really tragically unfortunate that we have seen a rise in hate groups since the election of Barack Obama in 2008. A huge increase in the number of these groups, number of members of the groups, and they've taken advantage of social media to spread like wildfire. And, you know, really tragically, we have a president that refused in 2017 to say that these were horrible people, that said that they were good people on both sides, and doubled down on that later. And even during the debates when he was challenged, to call out these white supremacists. He refused to do so. He did it a couple of days later when 65 million people weren't watching. And then interestingly enough, last night during the vice presidential debate, when Kamala Harris asked the vice president, why didn't the president call out these white supremacists? He refused to do so. And the vice president said, no, that's not true. And I mean, it's just amazing to me that we live in a country where people continue to delude themselves and think that these are fringe elements in our society. They are not fringe elements. We have consistently, and I think Hollywood has played a big role in this, consistently portrayed these people as these crazy and unintelligent people. But as when you look at the details of this particular case and meticulous planning that they went through, these are not unintelligent people. These are people who are very intelligent, very savvy. They may be the most horrific people in the country, but that doesn't mean that they're not smart, that they are not utilizing the technology that's available. They are actively recruiting young people through social media on a consistent basis. We have, social media platforms like Facebook that has helped them tremendously. And unfortunately, they refuse to take steps necessary to prevent this from continuing to spread. And so we are really facing a crisis in this country, I believe, that is something that we've never seen before, because they have access to more people using, the internet and social media than they could have ever had in the past. And we better wake up as a society. When my father-in-law has a saying, he says, you better wake up. And I'm telling America, it's time to wake up and realize that until we really do something very specific, not just this lawsuit, but really come together and force our elected officials to do something about the rise in these hate groups and the violence that they've been perpetrating, running into crowds of protesters, all of the things that we don't hear about on the news because the media is not covering these things in detail. They haven't covered this case. This lawsuit should have been national news when it was filed, but it hasn't been. We have to become more aware of these things so that we can fight back in the right way.
The trial was going to be October 26th, which would have been very interesting timing, given what's happening the next week in our country. But because of COVID, like everything else, it's been moved to April of next year. But, I listened to what you said, Reggie, and we have a Justice Department. And I use that word only because that's the official name of it. And I don't mean this in a partisan way, mostly. And that is, they deny that this is happening. They deny that there is institutionalized racism. They mock the words bias. How we use this trial and are talking, and you're an invited speaker all over the place. We have to make sure we're talking about this trial so people know it. And time is running out. But what I do want to say is I'm really afraid for you guys. And I was afraid before the armed people, armed to the teeth, who were going to kidnap the Michigan governor. What are you doing? How are you ensuring your safety? And it must cost a lot of money.
Yes. Well, and I think, to the point you were just making about the Justice Department, earlier this week, the Department of Homeland Security put out a report that had actually been long delayed because Trump appointees tried to bury it, that specifically says white supremacist terror is, quote, the most persistent and lethal threat to our country, full stop. And that is who we're dealing with, to the point that Reggie was making and you were making, Hannah. Like, this is who we're dealing with. These are smart people who are utilizing the tools that they've been given, have turned social media into their clan den in their own ways, and are then taking that planning and turning it into real world action. And unfortunately, it's not just what we saw in Charlottesville, but it's also part of the very real security threats we deal with in the course of litigating this case. I always check to see if my mother's watching when this question comes up, because this is not her favorite part of my job. I don't think any of our parents or family members are too thrilled about this element of our work. There are very real threats against us. There's no way to sort of sugarcoat it. They are vile and violent and anti-Semitic and misogynistic and racist in every other word you would imagine. Some are from our defendants directly against our team. So for example, Chris Cantwell, who was actually just sentenced, or rather found guilty of extortion and threats last week in a separate case, threatened our lead attorney, Robbie Kaplan, talking about all the fun he was going to have with her when this was over. But I think what's even more concerning in some ways than the direct threats from the defendants, which are still real and still concerning given their own capacity for violence, what's even more concerning is their ability to use social media to rile their loyal followers to action. And we've seen this firsthand, whether it's the harassment and threats that's directed at me or at Mike or at others, because we are on a list, for example, of Jews that they have speaking out against white supremacy. They have this on their far-right site called Telegram. And they quite literally just have a running list of Jews that they believe they're noticing, as they call it, speaking out against white supremacy. And the point of that is to direct harassment and threats at these people. And, you know, on and on the list goes. I don't need to sort of share the gory details because you could imagine. So it's not pleasant and it is expensive. To be frank, security is the biggest line item in IFA's budget by far for this reason. Because the most important thing that we can do is ensure our lawyers, our plaintiffs, our expert witnesses, and my own team at IFA are safe as we take on this case. And it's also important to make sure that they don't win, that their attempts to use threats and violence as a means to get us to back down aren't successful. Because that's not what our justice system is meant to be about. Our justice system is about holding people accountable when they break the law. And they're using their ongoing threats and violence as a means to undermine that, and we're not going to let them.
Well, about 4 or 5 questions just at the same time hit our technology, and people want to know what they can do. And as we close this, there's so much more to talk about, I know. Please visit the website. Many things have been posted since we have begun. And there are videos that are posted and news reports, and it will be updated a lot. And the IFA's website it went away.
IntegrityFirstForAmerica.org.
Okay. And the other thing we can do, and it's something we all must do, and that is make sure that there is enough money for the security, for the evidence development. Most of the people are volunteering their time. This is pro bono work, but there are still huge expenses to this lawsuit. So one, I would say go to the website and become more and more, you'll know more in depth what's going on. Number 2, write a check. And when you know people who can write really big ones, let us know, and we will talk to them. And number 3, you all have what we used to call Rolodexes. Everyone who you communicate, family, friends, not friends, everybody needs to know about this. We can't depend on the media to cover this the way we want. Everybody is, you know, focusing on COVID and the election. The trial being in April makes it a little easier, but I want to make sure that that we let people know and that we educate people. And frankly, I think it'll help with the trauma we have all experienced because of so much non-accountability. And this is holding people accountable. And I want to wish all of you who are giving your time and energy to this important lawsuit, I want to wish you the best of luck. And we all promise to spread the word as much as we can. This entire program will be taped, is being taped. It will also be on the website, so you can send it on. And I just really want to thank the panelists and the museum and all the other sponsors. And since I don't have the list in front of me, I'll let you list it, Amy. But I want to thank everyone who put energy and resources into this program and what is about to happen. From the bottom of my heart, I thank you all.
Thanks so much, Hannah.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Hannah.
To wrap things up, since I can never say no to anything Hannah asks, the program was sponsored not just by the Jewish Museum Milwaukee, but the Holocaust Museum LA, the National Museum of American Jewish History, and Nurturing Diversity Partners, or Reggie, Ings his shingle. So again, really thank you to all of you for being a part of this, and to Hannah and Reggie for joining us, and to all of the whole Milwaukee and Wisconsin community for coming out virtually tonight. I will just end by saying I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. Hannah opened by talking about how she was the daughter of Holocaust survivor. And it's so easy to be frightened and scared and angry in this moment. And that's fair. It is certainly fair. But unlike my grandparents' generation, we do live in a country that is, at least for now, governed by the rule of law and has a justice system and has laws like the KKK Act and the ones we're using here. And we can fight back through them. So that is what we are doing. I always like to remind people that it's not all doom and gloom, that we have tools to fight back, and that this case uniquely provides a tangible way to do so. So we are so grateful to all of you, again, to Hannah, Reggie, and the museum, all of the sponsors for making tonight possible. And if you were so inspired, we will also send this out to you via email, but please go to integrityfirstforamerica.org, donate, spread the word however you can, and don't let this issue fall off the radar screen. It's just too important.
Thank you all. Thank you.